In 2026, an AI was given access to real financial records from 1912, banking data, insurance payouts, stock movements, and private wealth tied to the Titanic. What it found wasn't just shocking, it was disturbing, because the Titanic didn't just sink a ship, it quietly changed who controlled the world. April 15, 1912, the Titanic disappears beneath the Atlantic, and over 1,500 people die. And for more than a century, the story has been simple: iceberg, panic, tragedy. But when Grok AI analyzed what happened after, the story didn't get clearer, it got worse. Because the first thing it calculated wasn't deaths, it was money. How much wealth actually went down with the ship, the vessel itself? Around $7.5 million back then, which sounds small until you adjust it and realize that's hundreds of millions today. Then the cargo. So luxury items, valuables, gold, personal assets, pushing the number into the billions in modern value. But that still wasn't the real number, because the real value wasn't sitting in safes or boxes, it was walking on deck, the passengers themselves. And this is where everything shifts, because these weren't random people, these were decision makers, investors, industrialists, people connected to banks, companies, entire industries. And when Grok mapped their financial networks, it didn't just see individuals, it saw influence. And when that influence disappeared in one night, the loss wasn't emotional, it was structural. And here's the part most people never think about. Wealth doesn't disappear. When someone dies, it moves, it transfers, it gets inherited, sold, absorbed. And when the AI tracked where that wealth went, a pattern appeared. It didn't spread out evenly, it moved toward existing power, families, business partners, financial networks that were already positioned to take it. And suddenly the question changed, not what was lost, but who gained from the way it was redistributed. And at the same time, global markets reacted. Insurance claims exploded, shipping confidence dropped, investors pulled back, but then something strange happened. The system stabilized faster than expected, almost like it adapted instantly and not evenly. Some groups recovered quickly, others didn't recover at all. And when Grok compared wealth distribution before and after the disaster, it found a shift, small but real. More wealth concentrated at the top than before, and that shouldn't happen randomly at that scale. And this is where the story stops being just a disaster and starts becoming something else. Because when you remove enough influence at once, the system doesn't collapse, it reorganizes, and the reorganization always has direction. And that direction usually favors those already in control. And Grok pushed the calculation further, not just what people own, but what they would have built, the deals they would have made, the companies they would have expanded, the future they would have shaped. And that number wasn't millions, it wasn't billions, it was tens of billions in lost potential. And now the scale changes completely, because this wasn't just a ship sinking, this was influence disappearing and being replaced, and replaced by who? The people already closest to power. And that's when the AI reached its first real conclusion. Yeah, the Titanic wasn't just a tragedy, it was a massive redistribution event, one that quietly shifted wealth and influence in ways no one noticed at the time. And once you see that, you can't unsee it, because the story you were told was about an iceberg. But the data tells a different story, not about what caused the sinking, but about what happened after, and why the world that came after looked slightly different from the one that existed before. And the most unsettling part is this: none of this required a plan. It's just how systems behave. Remove enough at the top and the system fills the gap. But it doesn't fill it randomly, it fills it strategically. And that's where the real impact begins. When Grok pushed deeper into the timeline, the numbers stopped being simple and started becoming patterns. SOAS, because short-term loss is easy to measure, but long-term impact is where the truth hides. So instead of looking at weeks or months, the AI tracked decades, mapping how wealth connected to Titanic passengers moved over time. And what it found wasn't chaos, it was direction. Because assets didn't scatter, they flowed. And they flowed toward people who were already positioned to absorb them. And this is where timing becomes everything. because the Titanic didn't sink during a quiet period. It sank during rapid global expansion. Industries were growing, markets were opening, money was moving faster than ever before, which meant any sudden shock didn't just create loss, it created opportunity. And opportunity during instability is never equal. It favors the prepared, the connected, the powerful. So when estates were liquidated, sales, when properties were sold under pressure, when businesses lost leadership overnight, the buyers weren't random. They were already inside the system, waiting. And Grok tracked this across sectors: real estate, finance, industry, and the same pattern kept appearing. Assets linked to victims didn't spread outward. They concentrated inward, strengthening existing networks instead of creating new ones. And this is where things get uncomfortable. Because when the AI looked at inheritance patterns, it found acceleration. Fortunes didn't just transfer, they grew faster afterward. Because inheriting large assets during unstable markets creates leverage, you gain control at the exact moment prices are low and opportunities are high, and that combination multiplies growth, meaning some fortunes became larger, not despite the disaster, but because of the conditions it created. And when you scale that across multiple families and networks, the effect compounds. And then the AI looked at industries, and here the impact became even clearer. Because when key individuals disappear suddenly, projects stop, decisions vanish, leadership collapses, and that creates openings. And openings in business are everything. Competitors step in, companies get acquired, power shifts hands, and Grok identified multiple cases where sectors changed direction after the Titanic, not dramatically overnight, but gradually, as leadership gaps were filled by different people with different priorities. And that's how influence moves, not in one moment, but over time, through a series of decisions that followed disruption, and then came the global effect. Because the Titanic wasn't local, it was international. Passengers came from multiple countries. Their wealth was tied to global systems. So when the ship sank, confidence dropped worldwide. Investors hesitated. Trade slowed. Risk perception increased. But what followed wasn't collapse, it was adaptation. Systems adjusted. Insurance became stronger. Financial institutions became more structured. And here's the key detail. Stronger systems often mean more centralized control, because stability requires coordination, and coordination concentrates power. So the very systems that were strengthened by the disaster also became more controlled, more organized, and less distributed. And Grok's models showed this clearly. Short-term instability, long-term consolidation, and this is where the idea of cost changes again. Because the Titanic didn't just cost money, it changed how money moved, it altered growth paths, it shifted who had access to opportunity. And when the AI ran alternate scenarios, asking what if the Titanic never sank, the results weren't dramatic, but they were consistent. Slightly more competition, slightly less concentration, slightly different industry outcomes. And those small differences matter, because over decades they compound into real change. And this is the part most people miss. History isn't shaped by massive, obvious differences. It's shaped by small shifts that build over time. And the Titanic created one of those shifts, not visible in the moment, but powerful in the long run. And when Grok combined all of this, inheritance acceleration, asset concentration, industry disruption, global system adaptation, it reached a conclusion that reframed the entire event. The Titanic wasn't just a loss, it was a reorganization, a moment where systems were forced to adjust under pressure, and those adjustments created a new balance of power, one that didn't look dramatic in 1912, but shaped everything that came after. And that's when the question changes again, because it's no longer just what happened on the ship, it's what changed in the world because of it, and who ended up closer to power when everything settled. By the time Grok finished its full calculation, the numbers weren't just shocking, they were almost impossible to visualize, because the Titanic's impact wasn't a single loss, it was a chain reaction, a series of shifts that kept compounding over time. And when those shifts were modeled across decades, the total economic impact reached into the trillions. Not because trillions physically sank into the ocean, but because trillions in potential were redirected, delayed, or absorbed into different networks. And this is where everything becomes uncomfortable, because the real cost of the Titanic isn't what was destroyed, it's what changed afterward, the opportunities that disappeared, the influence that moved, the decisions that were never made, and the power that quietly consolidated over time. And this is the part people don't like thinking about, because it forces a different way of seeing history, not as isolated events, but as pressure points that reshape systems. And when Grok zoomed out even further, it started comparing the Titanic to other major disruptions, not to suggest they were connected, but to see if the same pattern appeared, and it did, over and over again. Economic shocks, market crashes, large-scale disasters, each one followed by the same sequence: instability, then adaptation, then consolidation. And every time the system reorganized, it tended to move in one direction, toward fewer people controlling more resources. And that's not a theory. That's what the data shows when you track wealth distribution over long periods. And the Titanic fits perfectly into that pattern, not as the cause, but as an early acceleration point, a moment where multiple variables shifted at once. And when that happens, the effects don't stay contained. They spread outward, through markets, through industries, through generations. And this is where the AI's projection models become important, because they don't just show what happened, they show how different things could have been. And when Grok ran alternate timelines, yes, the differences weren't dramatic in the short term, but over decades they became significant. Slightly more competition, slightly less concentration, slightly different industry leaders, and those small differences compound because power builds on itself. Once you have more resources, you gain more opportunities, which leads to even more resources. And that feedback loop is what shapes the structure of entire economies. And when the Titanic disrupted that loop for certain individuals, it didn't stop the system, it redirected it. And redirected systems don't just bounce back, they evolve in a new direction. And that direction matters because it determines who has influence in the long run. And this is where the idea of true cost becomes clearer, because it's not just about money, it's about control. Who controls industries? Who controls investment flows? Who controls decision making at the highest levels? And when Grok layered all of this together, lost growth, redistributed assets, industry shifts, long-term consolidation, it reached a conclusion that reframes everything. The Titanic wasn't just a tragedy, it was a structural shift, a moment where the system adjusted under extreme pressure and came out slightly more concentrated than before. And that shift didn't reverse. It continued, reinforcing itself over time. And this is why the impact still exists today, because once a system moves in a certain direction, it tends to keep moving that way unless something equally large pushes it back. And that rarely happens, because large disruptions don't usually redistribute evenly. They reinforce existing structures. And that's exactly what Grok's analysis showed. And then it took it one step further. It calculated not just the historical impact, but the ongoing effect. How much of today's economic structure can be traced back to cumulative shifts like this? And while the Titanic is only one piece of that puzzle, it's a clear example of how these moments work, because you can see the before, you can see the after, and you can measure the difference. And when you understand that, the story changes completely, because now it's not just about a ship hitting an iceberg. It's about what happens when a system is forced to adapt suddenly, and who ends up stronger afterward. And this leads to a final realization that is far more unsettling than any theory, because it doesn't rely on hidden information, it relies on observable patterns. So, the world we live in today is shaped not just by innovation and progress, but by disruptions that quietly redirected everything. And most people never notice, because the change doesn't happen in one moment. It happens slowly, through a series of adjustments that feel normal at the time, but look very different when you step back and connect them. And this is why Grok's analysis feels different, because it doesn't tell you something new happened, it shows you something that was always happening, just at a scale most people never measured. And once you see it, it becomes impossible to ignore, because you start asking a different question. Not just what happened in 1912, but how many other moments like that exist? How many times has the system been reshaped under pressure? How many shifts have happened quietly while attention was focused somewhere else? And this is where the ending hits hardest, because the Titanic didn't just sink into the ocean, it sank into the structure of the modern world, leaving behind a shift that is still influencing how wealth and power are distributed today. And that shift didn't end, it became part of a pattern that repeats whenever systems are forced to adapt. Meaning the real story of the Titanic isn't just what happened that night, it's what changed afterward, and how those changes continue to shape everything we see today. And once you understand that, the tragedy feels different. Not smaller, but larger. Because now, it's not just about the lives lost, it's about the direction the world took because of it, and how that direction is still unfolding right now, in ways most people never even think to question.